a year. That's 350,000 people since 9/11 have died on the highways. And yet, are we having a war on automobiles? Are we going to shred the Constitution in order to kill off our automobile enemies? I don't. Maybe we should, but that's another topic. Every 26 days we have a 9/11 on the highways, statistically. And then let's not even get started with tobacco. Over 500,000 people killed a year by this evil weed. That's the true evil weed. That's a 9/11 every 2 days. Maybe we should have a war on tobacco and burn the Constitution and all of that just so we could get rid of tobacco. Yeah, maybe we really should be doing things about automobiles and tobacco. But as you can see, this overreaction to terrorism is really pretty obvious. Next slide. Next question. Well, actually, I should say that before we talk about is it really a war, statistically, I dug up some more statistics since I did that slide, which are in the book about, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than to be killed by terrorists. You're more likely to drown in your bathtub than to be killed by terrorists. And you're hundreds and hundreds of times more likely to be killed by your doctor's malfeasance than to be killed by terrorists. So if we could revise Shakespeare to say, first we kill all the doctors? No. Okay, so and this does lead us to the next question, though. Is war really the right metaphor for what's going on here? Do we really need to have a war on terror? How can you have a war on terror? Terror is an abstract noun. It means extreme fear. So having a war against this abstract noun, meaning extreme fear, is a very strange concept when you think about it. It's almost as strange as having a war against mind-altering substances. Now that's pretty strange too. And the best thing about this, from the viewpoint of the Orwellians who invented this war on terror, is, of course, it's endless, right? I mean, how could we possibly win a war against terror, right? Well, won't there always be fear out there? So this is a recipe for a regime based on the politics of fear for the rest of the history of humanity. It's pretty strange. Could we maybe end this war on terror by changing the metaphor, or at least maybe just ending the metaphor by realizing that it's an utterly ridiculous idea to fight a war against terror? Next slide. Oh, back one. Okay. And this is the mantra you hear on Fox News. But aren't there people out there who want to kill us? And then, of course, they go to 9/11, 9/11, 9/11. They want to kill us. Who are they? Well, those evil Muslims, of course. Really? Who are all these people who want to kill us so bad? Since 9/11, where is the evidence, really, that motivated, capable, competent Muslims are trying to kill lots of Americans? I really don't see it. If they wanted to, they probably could do it. Take one of these automatic weapons to the shopping mall or something, or, I mean, who cares about airplanes? They just get an Amtrak train or derail the train, like I tried to do once when I was 4 years old with a rock. But before I was a Muslim, right? I guess I was born to be a member of the Axis of Evil. I don't know. But there's a very good reason why even radical anti-imperialist Muslims like me have absolutely no desire to kill large numbers of American civilians. I mean, even no matter how mad we get, and I get pretty mad sometimes about massacres in Iraq and Afghanistan and Gaza and so on and so forth, and injustice. But the idea that killing huge numbers of American civilians would somehow contribute to ending those things is absurd, just as if the Vietnamese had thought that blowing up American skyscrapers was somehow going to get the U.S. out of Vietnam. Quite obviously, it would have gotten the U.S. deeper into Vietnam, maybe given Nixon that excuse to nuke Hanoi, which he was raving about in those days. Actually, was pretending to be a madman. Kissinger thought up that strategy. But in any case, the Vietnamese were obviously not dumb enough to think that this was going to help them. And Muslims really aren't either. I mean, yeah, there are dumb Muslims, just like there are dumb Christians and Jews and Hindus and atheists and Buddhists. But if they're that dumb, they're probably not going to be very competent at trying to kill a whole lot of people anyway. In all the major Muslim authorities, with a few very dubious and weird exceptions you can find here and there, tend to agree that 9/11 was un-Islamic. It was an attack on civilians, certainly the attack on the World Trade Center. I guess you could argue that if you were at war with the United States, attacking the Pentagon would be just like, attacking any other military target. But I don't even hear that. From the Muslim authorities I've heard, including Osama bin Laden, who deplored these attacks repeatedly and said he had nothing to do with it after September 11th, which was largely ignored by our media. Pretty much all the Muslims, including the radical ones, agree that 9/11 was un-Islamic. And I don't hear any of them thinking that it would be a good idea to massacre large numbers of Americans. Next slide. Another question then is, okay, well, if there's no reason for these radical Muslims to be doing anything like 9/11, did they really do it? And well, what's the evidence that they did it? And by they, I guess now we should be talking, of course, about the specific people who've been accused of this extreme crime against humanity rather than all of the world's Muslims. So, well, who's been blamed so far? Basically bin Laden, 19 Arabs with box cutters, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and a couple of his friends, supposedly. Well, what's the evidence against these people? And if you seriously ask this question and look skeptically at what's been brought forward as evidence, to say that it's weak is a real understatement. For instance, bin Laden, as I said, has repeatedly denied and deplored 9/11 right after it happened in September and October of 2001. And then in December of 2001, a video surfaced, a very low-quality video that had been supposedly found by some unnamed U.S. serviceman in a house in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. We never heard who that serviceman was. You would think he would have been a national hero for finding the evidence that proved bin Laden really did it, even though he kept denying it. But no, we've never heard about this guy. We've never heard any details. We never heard where the house was. There's no chain of possession for this video. And the video itself is highly dubious, to say the least. So many of the images show what appears to be a very overweight guy who doesn't look that much like bin Laden, with writing with the wrong hand, wearing fancy jewelry, and sort of chortling over 9/11, but not even really taking credit for it unless you distort the translation, which is what they did. So Professor Bruce Lawrence of Duke University, who is by no means a conspiracy theorist, he's just one of our leading experts, if not the leading expert on bin Laden. He's the author of Messages to the World, which is a university press publication on bin Laden, a very good introduction to bin Laden's thought. He came on my radio show, and when I asked him about this so-called smoking gun confession video, he said, it's bogus. And then he went on and said, I don't think I'm alone in this. He said all of his many acquaintances in the 24/7 bin Laden detail in Homeland Security know that it's bogus. And I then said, well, why don't they say anything? And then he said, well, he said that it's very convenient in some quarters to think that bin Laden and bin Laden alone did this and did it the way they say he did it, because if you veer away from that in any way, the other possibilities are so horrific. So the evidence against bin Laden is so weak that even the FBI says that he's not wanted for 9/11, even though he's wanted for other terrorist acts. How about the hijackers, the 19 guys who they say actually carried this out? Well, normally, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Normally. But in some cases it is. If you don't see any evidence that there's a pink elephant dancing around in your living room, that's probably pretty good evidence that there isn't one. So there are these cases. And in the case of these 19 hijackers, the elephant in the living room is that we should have seen the evidence that these guys were on the planes right away. And that evidence would have consisted of security videos showing them boarding the attack planes. And we've never seen any of that except for one transparently bogus, a fake video of a couple of these guys at Dulles Airport. And then there's one video of Muhammad Atta in Portland, Maine. That's not an attack plane, and there's no real proof that that's even authentic either. There should have been authenticated, dated, timestamped security videos of all these guys getting all these planes, and they should have been all over the media as soon as the U.S. government decided to accuse these particular people. And yet, no such video evidence. There should have been authenticated passenger lists. Every flight has authenticated passenger lists. The airlines are required by law to keep them, and they were, or should have been at least, seized by the FBI and then made public as soon as the U.S. government presented its case against these 19 guys. No such authentic passenger lists have ever shown up. We've just gotten some passenger lists supposedly leaked by the government to the media and published in the media, and there are different ones that list actually different names. They don't completely match up. So we've never seen any real passenger lists for these planes. There are no ticket stubs, which would have been produced as evidence that these guys had boarded the planes. And we've never seen one shred of testimony from any of the airline employees who would have ticketed and boarded these guys. In this case, it seems to me that absence of evidence that these guys were even on the planes is pretty good evidence that they probably weren't, especially when you throw in evidence that they turned up alive shortly after 9/11, or at least about 10 of them did. And several of those reports are very strong. People who want to look into this can read Jay Kolar's article published in a scholarly publication edited by Paul Zaremka, published by Elsevier, which is the leading scholarly publishing house in Europe, in which he concludes that at least 10 of these guys were alive, credibly reported alive post 9/11, and one other had been dead before 9/11. The case against Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which that's the one that's really coming into the media now. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, reportedly the confessed mastermind of 9/11, actually was far from that. Next slide. Next slide. We'll skip bin Laden's statement. Okay, we're not getting to the slide I was looking for, but Khalid Sheikh Mohammed confessed, supposedly, after he'd been waterboarded more than 150 times in 1 month. High-intensity torture was used on this guy. The 9/11 Commission report used Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's alleged confessions as its main source of evidence for its version of what happened on September 11th. And yet, that supposed evidence was not obtained from the actual interrogations. Nobody from the 9/11 Commission ever got to witness any interrogations of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They never got to see any videos of these interrogations. They never got to hear any tapes. They never got to see any translated transcripts. All they got, actually, was these secondhand reports from that ultimately derived from these war criminals who tortured him, whose word would not stand up in any court in the world. So that's pretty weak evidence. And if you want more information about that, my website, truthjihad.com, has a 50-page article going into great detail about the case against KSM and his alleged co-conspirators. Okay, here's Bruce Lawrence. And this is the exact quote on my radio show. He said, if one tears open just a little bit of that slick covering of public misinformation and says, who would have done it if not bin Laden, it's pretty horrific. So that's why all of his friends in the CIA and Homeland Security know that the confession video is phony, but won't say so in public. Next slide. So KSM, he's already been found guilty by the corporate media and by our president, Obama, who had a, I don't recall the exact quote, but basically he said he's guilty. He was waterboarded 183 times in 1 month and confessed to all sorts of crimes that he couldn't possibly have committed, including the murder of Daniel Pearl and others. He actually confessed to crimes that committed while he was incarcerated. Next slide. Where do we get this idea that KSM had something to do with 9/11? This is the guy who fingered him. Abu Zubaydah is a schizophrenic, not terribly bright individual who was picked up, tortured, and under torture he named KSM as being involved in 9/11. Next slide. It appears that Abu Zubaydah was really the only source for this allegation that KSM was the mastermind. Senator Carl Levin offered a really interesting interpretation of why this kind of torture was necessary. He said, the CIA's torture techniques are based on tactics used by Chinese communists against American soldiers during the Korean War, for the purpose of eliciting false confessions